Welcome to Preprocessing Paragraphs, a beginner's guide. Very excited to go through this. So let's get started. A couple of things at the top. The slides are posted on the MidCamp session, so if you want to download them and follow along there, I'd recommend it. Also, I have a GitHub sample repo of the things that we're going to be going through today. It's a bit easier to see some of the text if you open it up on your text editor, since some of the lines are really small on the screen, so just a heads up, those two things. A little bit about me first, though. This is my dog, Buka, that we just adopted recently. My name is Larry Walangitan. I'm a senior developer at Chromatic. You can follow me at Twitter. Chromatic, just a little bit about them. We are a fully distributed team. We work with Drupal, JavaScript, a bunch of web tech, doing some interesting things. We have an awesome blog and a Twitter presence, so check us out, follow us along. The GitHub repo, I'm going to leave this up just for a second. It's a sample module that I have created where we kind of go through what we're going to be going through here today. You'll be able to see the code in further context. So it's git.io/fjf6y. I'm just going to leave this up here for a sec.
Case sensitive?
No.
Okay.
All lowercase.
Yeah.
Hold on.
All right.
I'm taking it wrong.
And while we're waiting, the final thing, I have some time left for questions at the end, so if you just want to hold your questions at the end, and if we run out of time, feel free to come up to me and talk to me, and I'll be happy to talk through some of the things that we're going through today.
It's supposed to be the lounge?
What was that?
It's supposed to be the lounge? Or I get the wrong, I typed it wrong.
That's what I got too.
That's what I got too.
Oh.
Come on, Larry.
I am sorry about this. Since it's pretty important, it's supposed to go and look like, oops, this.
No, that's not.
Interesting.
Oh, is this like github.com?
Yes, it's like github.com, git.io/fjf6y. This is like the short link that they created that I pasted, which, yeah, if you search for me on GitHub, Walangitan, Chromatic Paragraphs, there's a repo there. Sorry about this.
Larry, it's supposed to full URL.
Oh,
Make it big.
good idea. For the recording, github.com/WALANGITAN/chromatic_paragraphs. Are we all set? Sorry about this technical difficulty. We're good? All right, yeah, so let's dive back into the session. A few learning outcomes. This is what I hope everyone takes away from our session today. First is that you'll be able to pre-process paragraphs and structure your pre-processing methods. We'll be going through some custom render arrays and how we override the Twig templates. We're going to talk briefly about reference nested entities, so like node references or taxonomy references. How do we pull that data into our Twig template for paragraphs? And finally, debugging our preprocessing and our Twig files without running out of memory or encountering the white screen of death. First, a few prereqs. So all I ask and hope that you're just familiar with Drupal 8. That can mean like you just have opened it, installed it, have an idea what it is. Twig, the templating language, and the Twig files that power the markup for Drupal 8. Just a familiarity with that, a familiarity with PHP, and also the paragraphs module as well. So let's do a really quick overview of what the paragraphs module is. Essentially, when you install it, you are given this entity with configurable fields. They're configurable just like nodes. You can create fields on them. They have different types, so you can have multiple different types of paragraphs, just like you can have multiple different types of nodes. And they all have specific view modes that you can create to customize your layout. Now, with preprocessing, we're going to be talking about a full customization, and we're not going to be using view modes at all. So this is an example of like what a paragraph could look like in your Drupal admin. There's several paragraphs here. First, we have a text paragraph at the top with a handful of fields. Below it is a quote paragraph. And then below that is a slideshow. So you can structure your fields however you want them. And when they output to the page, this is a visual representation of what those paragraphs would look like. So on the right is your web page as viewable in your client. And on the left is the paragraphs that compose that web page that you can configure, you can move them around. We're going to be talking about styling and preprocessing so that we have full control over how these are represented on the web page. So preprocessing, when we boil it down, it's essentially just data transformation. So we get our field data and we want to do something with it. Also, we are separating our concerns. So the logic that we have all lives outside of the template. Now, Twig is super powerful, and there's a lot of things that we can do within Twig to transform the data or filter it or do multiple things. We're going to be doing all of this within our preprocessor instead of Twig. And finally, customization. This is the custom markup that we're going to be writing, and we're outputting as render arrays. Now, render arrays are what Twig consumes and presents on the web page. So first, we have a few things. To get started, we would need to download and install the paragraphs module, configure a paragraph just like you configure any sort of node or entity, and then finally create a custom module. So sorry about the sample repo. This is all set up there. And we're going to be talking about this preprocessing recipe. So I wanted to take some of the knowledge that I learned from a client and how we approached it and apply it to a talk. So with each paragraph, we're going to apply 4 steps. First is, in our hook theme, in our custom module, we define the paragraph type. Second, we're going to be handling all of our preprocessing inside of a class. Third, inside of that class, each paragraph type is going to have a corresponding method where we actually do the transformations and the full preprocessing. And then finally, we're linking it up back to our Twig template with a corresponding paragraph template. Now we're going to be going through each one of these in detail. So let's start with the first one. Hook theme, our setup. There are 3 main array keys that we need to be aware of in order to get things rolling so that our paragraphs preprocess as expected. The first is base hook. Second is the variables that we want to create. And finally, the path where our template lives. So inside of hook theme, this is what it would look like for a paragraph that we defined as foo. First, we have our base hook. We're sending in a paragraph. We have a few variables that we're defining. And finally, our path. Now let's dive even deeper and kind of go through each one of these piece by piece. The first one is base hook. So base hooks, these are defined in another module's hook theme. So like node has a base hook, taxonomy terms have a base hook. With the paragraphs module, we have to make sure we define the base hook as paragraph so that it knows to override and extend the paragraph base hook with the custom modules that we are, with the custom variables that we are creating in our custom module. So let's take a look at those variables. Now variables, this is just an array of custom variables and their default value. So we're defining here header with a default value of null and text with a default value of null. And finally, our path, this is where our paragraph's custom template lives. Now, $path, this variable, it's in hook theme. So all that we're doing here is just concatenating from our module's root directory. So all of the templates live in chromatic _ paragraphs / templates / paragraph. This is just for organization's sake. Now next in the story of how do we preprocess is the bulk of it handled by our preprocessor class. So in the sample repo and in our custom module we have source / paragraph preprocessor.php. This is just setting up a class to handle all of the sort of programming and functionality that we want to have within our preprocessor. Now within this, we're going to be defining custom methods, which are just functions that are available to us that we're going to be creating to do the actual preprocessing. So we're setting up our preprocessor class here, and inside of it we have a preprocess method defined as preprocess foo. We're going to see what this looks like in the actual module in a second, but we're just going to talk through what this actually does. So at its most basic level, all we're doing is retrieving the data from our paragraph that we set up in the config and install. And then we're going to be returning specific variables that we defined earlier, header and text, that are referenced in the render array that we defined earlier in the hook theme. So further down on our module, we have our class, and right below that is our custom preprocess foo method. Now, I'm defining here at the top content, because content is essentially what we're going to be looking for our fields. There's a lot of data in variables that's available to us. This kind of just narrows it down so that we can essentially follow the same recipe of content and pass in the field machine name and getting the field values this way. So here we're defining our variables as header and text, like we're in our hook theme. And below that in comments is what it would look like when we output it in our Twig template. So let's take a look at that Twig template. Here we have paragraph -- foo.html.twig. And all it's doing is just we have our own customizations. We have a div, we have our header, and we have our text. So we're pulling in that data that we had in our preprocessor, and we have specific variables that we can go through and assign in here. So we have full control over how we want our template files to look and the kind of variables that are inside of it. In the sample repo, there's some more comments at the top about what's defined and that sort of thing if you want to step through it. So this kind of is like the steps of going through and what it would look like to preprocess from our hook theme to our class, to our methods, to then finally our template. But there's a bit of optimization. So you can imagine when you're creating your site, you have a site with dozens of different types of paragraphs. We want to avoid having to do a bunch of copy and paste, since it's like the same process for each paragraph is what we're following with our preprocessing recipe. So we're going to help optimize that by creating our first service. So in services.yaml, we're just going to do two things: create our service, chromatic paragraphs preprocess, and we're going to call the class that we've been working with in this presentation today. We're just going to call paragraph preprocess, which allows us to have access to the methods that exist on that class. Now it looks like this inside of the text editor. We just have services, our chromatic paragraphs, and then defining our class. So then, now that we have all of this, like how does it finally link up in our module? In our module file, we need to make sure that we call template preprocess paragraph the name of our paragraph. This is the machine name _ foo in this case. So this might look different than what you might be familiar with some custom modules. Like why aren't we doing like chromatic paragraphs _ preprocess paragraph, that sort of naming convention? It's because we're calling template because template is a very specific word that will prepare the variables for our paragraph template. So this was frustration when I was working through this the first time when I was trying to preprocess some paragraphs. Like, why was this not working? It's not super clearly defined in the documentation and the API, but It's something that's critical that we need to remember when we're trying to preprocess our paragraphs. And this is what it looks like in the text editor. So at the top, I've done a few things. First, I've defined a constant. So this is something that will be available to us throughout without having to like copy and paste. It's just a preference of mine. In our template preprocess paragraph foo, we are calling our custom service. And it's going to prepare our variables and return them with our method that exists on the class. So diving a bit deeper, we're going to talk really quickly about nested entities. So when you have a field that is calling another entity, so you have a paragraph field that calls a different kind of node and you want to get the field values on that, how do we do that? It's 2 steps. First, you just load that entity, and then you return the values. Now this slide is going to be a bit small just because of how wide everything is. So just a heads up, I'll define it for you. So at the top, we're just checking to see with that our field has a value. So we have a field, another node is our machine name. And we're just checking to make sure that we have a node reference in there before we do anything. And then stepping down, if that field exists, we're going to return the field header value for the entity reference. And below that, in comments, is what our Twig, what it would look like output in our Twig template. So putting it all together, let's kind of go through the steps again. So each one of these, we have a paragraph type. We make sure it's defined in the hook theme. The second one is very important, but we only necessarily just need to do it once since we're working with paragraphs, is just defining a class that all of the methods live in. And each method essentially is a function. And then step 3, for each paragraph type, we make sure each one has a corresponding method to do the actual preprocessing. And step 4, the result of our hard work, each paragraph type has a Twig template as an outcome. So a quick use case, like what is the ideal use case for preprocessing paragraphs that I come across? The first one is component libraries. Now this component library, if you're not familiar, is a front-end developer will create like HTML and markup and CSS that matches to what you want to develop in your CMS. And it's fully defined for you. And so with preprocessing, you can just match the markup and like plug in your values where you need them to be. So for example, here we have a block quote, and there are certain components in each blog post. So we have a citation, a source, an attribution. Now we can define these fields in a paragraph, and with our preprocessing, define specific variables to represent each field and just kind of plug and play with the Twig template into the citation for the block quote, into where the p tag is, like that's where the content would live, and then the by Neil Stevenson would be like where the attribution field would live as well. Now, with a component library like the CSS and JavaScript is usually all prepared, so you can kind of just like you copy and paste, like you mimic that and you pull in your values. That's what we're trying to do here. Another example is an audio paragraph so that we can have a link to the source where the audio source lives. We'll have a label for this, and then also a description. So there's a lot of power in paragraphs because you can essentially like see your site as components. And if you're working with a front-end developer, they can create these components and you can like translate them to your Twig templates, do your preprocessing, set up your configuration for your paragraph fields, and like plug in the values. This helps with a lot with velocity in terms of just creating things. And this is like my own personal experience with clients in the past of how we've gone through the process of them creating components. I translate them into Drupal, into paragraphs. They come up with new components. We do the same process again and again. So when it all goes wrong, when things like you follow this process, but things still aren't linking up, we debug. So 2 debugging tools that I want to give a shout out to. The first one is a module, Twig var dumper. Now this is for debugging on the front end. So if you have a Twig template and you want to see what's inside of a variable, you can use Twig var dumper to call a debugging function to see what exists in there. And then by default, we have a Symfony component, var dumper, which Twig var dumper uses. This is a back-end debugging, so when you're preprocessing file, you would be able to call this to like see that before it gets to the front end and the template. And finally, when you're running out of memory, this is a trick from Morton that I've used a ton of times. This will return all available values within a template within the context. So you can see like all of the different keys and variables that you have available to you inside of a template, and from there do further debugging. So this is if you're trying to call those other debugging functions, they don't work. This usually works almost 100% of the time. So we have a few minutes for some question and answers, but real quick, tomorrow, get involved. There's contribution day. Saturday, you don't have to know how to code. Amy June Heinlein from Canopy is going to be doing a training. At the end, I'm going to have my session review here. I'll go through and re-upload my slides to make sure that the GitHub link references the right page there, so we'll get that debugged. But yeah, that's pre-processing paragraphs. We have some time for questions, so thank you very much. Yes?
Yeah, what were the benefits of those two modules you mentioned? Twig bar dumper and was it composer or something or other?
Yeah, so the question is, what were the benefits of the two modules? So VAR-dumper, all of these debugging things are available to us in Drupal. These kind of extracted, so there's an easier way. VAR-dumper makes it easier to debug in the front end, in your Twig template specifically. And VAR-dumper as a Symfony component, I found it more reliable than using Kint or the Devel module. And it's available to us as well. So those are two. Heads up, you don't need to really do much to get VAR-dumper up and running. With Twig VAR-dumper, you just install the module.
To do the Symfony component, do you have to specify in your composer file, or is it automatically there with Drupal?
I believe it's automatically included now, so you should be able to access it. There's a link to like the documentation on the slide of how you do that. Yes?
So in this case, this is all done within a module. And on most sites where you're doing a one-off theme with components that are not really redistributable beyond that site, how would you change this if you were doing it in the theme instead of in a module?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So the question is, we covered today doing this in a module. How would we do this within a theme? Essentially, the same steps would exist. What we're doing with creating a class and creating methods within that class would all exist within your hook theme if you want, or you can create a class in a similar sort of structure. Now, this is kind of opinionated in the way that I've done it. Based off of client experience, we created it in the module instead of the theme because there are multiple sites having separate themes but wanting to use the same components. So if you're in a theme, you'd have the same hook theme. You would define. You can cut out some of the things like the services, and you could just call those template _ preprocess functions. And inside of there, you can do your preprocessing without having to like look to an external class. Does that help solve?
Yeah. So we just cut out one of the steps. It sounds like.
Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up on that?
Yeah, sure.
What value does the service provide? Like, why make the class in the first place?
So another part of, so why make the class in the first place? What does the service component provide in this? And this is like also, this whole presentation is like tinged with my own programming opinions. And I just like having things separated out so that in the module file, we are calling separate classes that are doing different things. So everything within the paragraph preprocessor, and this was working with different people across the team. It was like a paradigm so that everyone knew that if you're doing any sort of preprocessing, it exists in that class. If we're doing anything external to it, it exists somewhere else and it's defined differently. So it was kind of just to make sure that devs that were being onboarded or people that were inheriting the site knew exactly where to look for preprocessing instead of having it all within like the .module file or creating a large module file map. Because it could exist there, but it's just like making it a bit easier to find later on. Any other questions, thoughts? Cool, not. Yeah, follow me. Come talk to me afterwards. Or was there a question that just popped up? Or? Sure.
So what does the service then do?
Oh, so what does the service do? It essentially allows us to be able to call that class anywhere. So we have it easily accessible to us.
Thank you.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So if anyone has any other questions or if some things were like a bit over your head, we can step through some of these things. I know that classes, methods, preprocessing, it's a lot, especially if you're new to Drupal or PHP. So feel free to reach out to me, follow me, and just find me and we can chat after. But yeah, that's my talk. Thanks so much for.